talk with you about understanding autism through the lens of culture because he himself is on the spectrum. So please join me in welcoming Paul today.
Okay, just to begin with, I'll introduce myself. My name is Paul Loudon. I am 30 years old. I was diagnosed at the age of 23 with Asperger's. And before that, I spent a lot of my life moving around from country to country. We probably moved every 2 years, and during that time we lived in both Pakistan and Indonesia. So I had a lot of experience with different cultures. And it sort of delayed the diagnosis because it was always a case of Paul is adjusting, he's in a new place with new people. So I spent a large part of my life seeing new places and not really fitting in, which is something that a lot of people on the spectrum experience, but in my case, a lot of it went with the fact that we were moving around. So I had the experience of growing up with autism and the experience of growing up around different cultures. And looking back on it, as I learned more about autism, I saw that a lot of my experiences gave me ways to understand myself and the people around me a little bit different from what it might have been if I hadn't been moving around. So to start with, I'm going to talk about a few different points, which is just what I mean by culture, what is culture, how autism affects the typical development of culture, so how culture develops in a young person, and how autism can shift this development in various ways. And once we see this, what this means for our ability to help someone on the autism spectrum or to help other people understand what the autism spectrum means. So to start with, basically, by culture, I simply mean, this definition is taken from dictionary.com, it's the behaviors and beliefs characteristic of a particular group. So any group of people can have a culture. A group of friends can have a culture which are their in-jokes or the ways they refer to each other. You can have a larger social culture such as American culture or the culture of a given state. Culture is basically just a set of shared beliefs. So, culture can affect many things. For example, you go out for beer with a group of your friends here. Do you know what you're ordering? Anyone in the audience know what you're ordering? If you just go out, not necessarily for beer, but to a bar with a group of friends. So you are ordering a specific thing. Now, in the UK, you go out for a beer with a group of friends. Do you know what you're ordering?
A pint.
What was that?
Pint.
A pint. Now, the thing is here in the US, we typically have the idea of a tab at a bar, where you get your bill at the end of the night, and it's a list of the individual things you've ordered. In the UK, it's more typical to have rounds, where one person buys drinks for everyone at the table, and they're picking what the drinks are. So in the UK, you can actually be seen as a problem if you want to order an individual drink because you aren't being part of the social crowd. You're also holding up the bartender's time because they have to, pour a specific drink just for you. You're holding up the server's time because they have to stop and take your order. So something that would culturally be perfectly acceptable here, ordering an individual drink that's different from those people who you are out with, is sort of a social no-no or social faux pas in the UK, simply because they have a different accepted practice. And it's something that would take someone from here often by surprise because, we see that the UK has a different culture than us, but a lot of times we expect it to be very, very similar. They've got McDonald's, they speak English, maybe they call a truck a lorry or something like that, but typically we don't think of their culture as being very different. Similarly, when I lived in Indonesia, we had electronics, and it was, I think, a stereo that broke, and we went to an electronics shop to have it repaired. And when we asked them how long it would take, they told us 2 more weeks. So we come back in 2 more weeks, and what did they tell us? 2 more weeks. So then we found they had a Baskin Robbins. They ran out of ice cream. We asked them when more was coming in. 2 more weeks. We eventually learned that 2 more weeks was their cultural way of telling us we don't know. It's sometime in the future. So this proved very frustrating for us at first because the phrase 2 more weeks to us literally means 2 more weeks. And that frustration came from an expectation we had that 2 more weeks meant what we thought 2 more weeks meant. Once we learned that to them 2 more weeks meant sometime in the future, when we were told 2 more weeks, we didn't get that same level of frustration because we began to understand that culturally, 2 more weeks was a very different prospect for them than it was for us. So, This leads us to the fact that similar does not mean identical. Just from culture to culture, just because cultures are similar, just because certain parts of them are identical, does not mean that our culture is identical to another culture. And this comes to, as I said, the 2 more weeks issue. Language is flexible. I know a lot of people on the autism spectrum tend to expect language to be very static. It can be very hard for us to adapt. The other thing is that people have their own expectations of which part of language is flexible and which part of language is static. 2 more weeks, to most of us, probably does not seem like a flexible concept. 2 more weeks is literally 2 weeks. It's a very simple thing. But for them, it was a very flexible thing. So culture also affects which parts of our language we see as flexible parts of our language and which parts we see as static. I know personally it drives me nuts when someone says, I was literally waiting forever. Because to me, literal means literal. It's a very simple concept. So when people mean it as figuratively or just as an expression of emphasis, it kind of drives me crazy. And I have to resist saying, no, you don't really mean that. That's just one of the things, I've had to adapt to, as many people do on the spectrum and off, is that language is a flexible thing, and each of us has different expectations about what it is. And these expectations are what build our frustration with any interaction, but typically with interaction with people on the autism spectrum, is that you become frustrated when someone on the autism spectrum does not behave the way you expect them to behave. It doesn't matter what kind of unexpected behavior, but if you already have an idea in mind how a situation is going to occur, how a situation is going to happen, and it doesn't happen that way, if you expect your son to finish his science project in 2 weeks, or expect your cereal to be repaired in 2 weeks, or you expect someone to buy a round for everyone at the table. When someone doesn't do it, when someone doesn't meet your expectations, then you get frustrated. And culture, in a way, defines our expectations. We share culture, and it tells us what kind of behaviors we can expect from another person. Our culture tells us what polite is and what polite isn't. In the US, polite is standing a certain distance from someone. But in Southeast Asia, polite may be very different in terms of what personal space means, or what body odor issues mean. So our cultures create a bunch of expectations within us. And these expectations then determine, in a large part, what we became frustrated by or what we don't become frustrated by, because we see people either living up to our expectations or sort of denying them. So culture is passed on as someone is growing. Typically, the culture of a parent and a child is very similar because a child observes culture by observing his family around him. You see your parent having a strong work ethic, or you see your parent being interested in sports, and you sort of become interested in what your parents are interested in. When they keep a house clean or don't keep a house clean, you decide typically that that's acceptable behavior. Whatever you see around you in the household where you're growing up, often a large part of that, not all of it obviously, but a large part of that is passed on to you as normally typical behavior. So as a parent, when your child doesn't meet your expectations or doesn't behave the way you expect them to, often it's something that fits into your cultural ideal of the world, where they behave in a large part how you expect, and the ways that they rebel are ways that you've seen other kids their age rebel because it's something they picked up from school or you've seen on TV. It's all still sort of part of the general culture that you picked up from the media around you, from other people around you. So typically, a lot of the differences between your personal culture and the culture of your child are sort of understandable. They're from an expected type. The problem comes with autism, because autism, as a lot of us here probably know, is typically put as a social disorder. It's an issue of understanding why certain behaviors are done by other people, understanding why those behaviors are meaningful to other people, understanding the motivations of those around you, why something makes someone happy, why something makes someone sad, why it's important to do this, why it's not important to do this, what the meaning of any given action is. These are the kind of things that a typical child often picks up just by observing. They develop their own understanding of the meanings of their parents' behavior in a typical development. But when they are on the autism spectrum, a lot of times they don't pick those up unless they're explained to them. And even then, how they're explained to them depends on their parents and how their parents understand their own reasons for doing things. So when you have a child who doesn't value the same things you do, who doesn't understand the same things you do, who doesn't do the same things you do, it tends to be more surprising because of how used to it you are from seeing other people around you develop that way, from how you developed with your parents. So your child diverges from your personal culture enough that it starts being frustrating and confusing. So the thing here is, I don't want to give the impression that people on autism have a specific culture. The idea here is that people with autism tend to have a different culture from that they grew up in. It may be different in subtle ways, it may be different in obvious ways, but the fact is that what they develop as they separate is different. And even if we cure autism tomorrow, if we find a pill that fixes all the physical aspects of autism, and these people start developing normally tomorrow, if I start developing normally tomorrow, I still grew up in a different culture. I have a different understanding of the world around me, of the people that grew up with me. I've seen different things, I've experienced them, I've come away with very different, meaningful experiences than other people have. So, when dealing with someone on the autism spectrum, higher functioning or lower functioning, it's important to be curious. You don't know what their culture is. You have expectations. If you went through the exact same experience they did, you typically experience them to take away most of what you took away from it. But you didn't. You're filtering through your own cultural experiences, the way you were raised, the experiences you had. So when dealing with someone on the autism spectrum, it becomes very important. You have a goal. You may want to treat them, you may want to integrate them in your class, you may want to help a child that is your son, is your nephew, is your brother. But it's important to ask questions and observe. Rather than trying to say, I think they're doing this because of this, when possible, try to find out from them why they think they did it. Approach every situation that you experience with a goal to learn first and teach second. Because you cannot teach someone why something is important. You cannot teach someone what to do, why to do it, until you have an understanding of what they feel is important. And so, often on the autism spectrum, our goal is to develop skills to help someone integrate better in day-to-day life. And you can do that, but until you start getting a little below that to the point where you're finding out why didn't they develop these skills initially, what part of them didn't see this as a valuable skill to have, then often you end up with someone who's experiencing anxiety, experiencing depression, because from day to day, they are going from activity to activity, and they know what they're supposed to be doing, but they haven't really integrated why they're supposed to be doing it. I am currently on medication for depression. I spent years in and out of depression, struggling. I barely finished high school, I struggled with college, I dropped out, and until I reached my autism diagnosis, I really had no idea what was going wrong, because no one knew what I was dealing with, and we couldn't even communicate about it, because I thought I was saying one thing, they thought they were saying one thing, we thought we were speaking the same language, and we weren't, because, again, of cultural differences. So until you reach this point where you're asking why in every situation, trying to understand, because honestly, I know personally that I'm trying to understand why they're doing things, but a lot of people on the autism spectrum aren't necessarily up to the point where they're even asking themselves, why am I doing these things? And even those who are may not be doing it well. I know I'm not doing it as well as I could be. So any interaction with someone higher functioning or lower functioning sort of requires both sides to be working on it, but just to be honest, a lot of you are probably going to be better at it than the people you're working with. So it's really helpful to be aware that this is something that needs to be done. So, as I said, we cannot bridge the gap until we can see both ends. If you want to work with something, you need to know If you want to work on something, if you want to work with someone, you need to know where they're standing and where you're standing. So I'd like to ask, in here, how many people have met someone from another country? If you look, almost everyone has their hands up. We all have probably met other cultures. We have personal tools for interacting with other cultures. Because for one thing, we live in the United States, where we tend to experience maybe Hispanics a lot here, or Canadians if you're up north, or if you're in a tourist city, people from Europe, or just all kinds of different people. And we've got tools for interacting with these other cultures, where you've met someone who seems a bit strange to you, and because you have these tools for other cultures, you sort of go, well, okay, he's doing this weird thing, I don't get it, but maybe it's something cultural to him. You might ask them, why are you standing so close to me? It makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Whereas someone where you expect them to know not to, you read it as he's intentionally trying to be intimidating, he's crowding me. So when you're filtering it through your own culture, you say, he's doing this because of this. But when it's an unknown culture, someone from someone else, you're more likely to say, why is he doing this, rather than I know why he's doing this. So a lot of us just from day to day, we've developed tools for dealing with what I call an unknown culture. It's a culture that you haven't formed enough expectations about to try to interpret it. And these are tools that you can actually use with someone with autism. Because that's where a lot of the problem comes from, is again, that we expect them to be from our culture in a lot of cases. So we say, well, he's standing close to me, tell him don't stand close to me. But he may have developed, well, personal space isn't valuable, so don't stand close to me doesn't necessarily tell him why not to stand close to me. But this makes me and a lot of people uncomfortable. It's polite not to stand close to me, gives them more of an understanding of what's going on there. It's just a case of, we can explain things in ways that aren't just what to do and what not to do, but why we find these valuable and how it can be helpful to people in day-to-day life. And we often have a lot of these tools already. So why this is useful, and this is sort of the key point here, is that it's useful to people who don't know anything about autism. A lot of us in the room, we understand to a degree what autism is. We've heard about it, we know the definition, maybe, hopefully most of us here have met someone who's on the spectrum and seen our own experiences of it. But maybe the teacher at your son's middle school has never met an autistic person in their life. Maybe the grandparents have just learned about the diagnosis and they don't know what it means. And the fact is, like I said, we've often experienced other cultures ourselves. We've been there, we've met people from other countries, or we've just seen them at Starbucks or whatever, but we have these tools for looking at other cultures and saying, what's going on here? What does this mean? And this is something that we can talk to other people about without ever having to go into what autism is. You can say, look, my child has autism, it means he does something differently. Think about how you would act if you met someone from a country you've never heard of. They've come from the country of, I don't know. I was trying to make up a name on the spot and I couldn't make up a name and I didn't want to say a real country's name. So an imaginary country. They've come from Narnia. How about that? So tell your grandparents, imagine he's come from Narnia, that you don't know how he grew up, you don't know what he came to. So rather than expecting him to behave a certain way, remember that typically they have good intentions. This is a good kid. I've raised him to be a good kid as best I can. Remember that he has good intentions. And when he does something that you see as bad, rather than just saying, that's bad, stop. Pretend like they're from somewhere different and maybe they don't know better, or maybe they were trying to do something good and you misunderstood it. So approach it with these tools that you have for dealing with other unknown cultures, rather than approaching it through the filter of your own culture, that, he stands really close to me, that's aggressive. If you're in Southeast Asia, if they stand really close to you, that's not aggressive. That's just how they stand around. They don't have the same concept of personal space. So, so basically, this is my point, is that we have these people who have developed a different culture from those around them, and this builds frustration. But we also all have these tools, and I mean everyone, pretty much, who's ever experienced another culture, whether they know anything about autism or not. And this gives us a language for talking to them about autism, because you can talk to them about it as other cultures without them having to really have a deep understanding of how it affects development or the mental and social issues that autism creates. But rather you can say, okay, here's a way you can work with it without really needing to get into this big, scary issue of autism. And autism is a scary word. It's a big, scary word. And people think about autism and they think about Rain Man and Dustin Hoffman and someone screaming when fire alarms go off and being confused by day-to-day life. And with 1 in 87 or less, or more rather, or more people being diagnosed with autism now, we have a lot of higher functioning autistics out there. We have a lot of lower functioning autistics who also have other problems, but they still typically have some understanding of what's going on around them and want to do good. And with the number of people we have being diagnosed with autism now, with the number of people we have under the autism spectrum, everyone is going to meet someone with autism at some point in their life. It's almost guaranteed. And with that being true, being able to talk about it in terms, using this structure of culture, of the idea of how we interact with unknown cultures, people from other countries, rather than treating autism as just straight up a disorder that you have to deal with, it gives people the way to have meaningful, progressive interactions, rather than just saying, okay, I have to put up with this person's problems. And really, that's about it. I'm afraid I spoke faster than I intended to, but I'm willing to address any questions you may have on this as well. But first, Kim Isaac here, who is got many years in the field, and I do a radio show and a podcast called Understanding Autism. And we talk about a variety of subjects. We have guests. We've had Dr. Adams a couple times. We've had people who are related to the field in a variety of ways talking about upcoming things like the DSM-4 and whatever. And you can find information on our show or episodes of it at the link here. We also have cards to give out if you need them. So does anyone have any questions? Since I'm afraid I speak really quickly, I'm sorry. I was going to say, everyone's tired at the end of the day.
No, I have a question. How do you feel, I mean, in your experience, okay, so growing up, you didn't know you had Asperger's until you were 23.
Yes.
So, like, what were your thoughts about when you would be communicating and things weren't translating to the person the way you thought they would? Like, how did that affect you?
Okay, she asked, I didn't get diagnosed until I was 23. When I was communicating and things weren't coming across as I expected them to come across, how did that affect me? Anxiety, depression, frustration. The problem I often had is that, you know, honestly, high school, a very emotional time for most people. You're trying to date, you know, for me, I had problems understanding that my goal was graduating, not learning things. I read about people cheating to get good grades, and that kind of baffles me because my objective there was always to learn the things, and I wasn't so, it wasn't so important to me what the grades were. So I don't understand, I mean, now intellectually I do kind of understand why someone might cheat to get grades because objectively your goal in high school is to graduate, not necessarily to learn any specific thing. But for me it was learning things. So a lot of times I felt like I was working at cross purposes to the world around me, that my goal was this, their goal was that, and I couldn't understand why they wanted me to do a certain thing. An example, and this is not related to high school, is a lot of times, you know, a parent will say, you know, the trash can's getting a little full. And that means take out the trash. To me, that always meant the trash can's getting a little full. You know, it's what they said. And so you get these situations where, for me, if I know that the garbage truck comes on Tuesday and Friday, I might take out the garbage on Tuesday if it's full by Tuesday. If not, I might let it fill up. But a parent might have the house's culture might be that we always take the garbage out from the trash, even if the trash can is only half full, because we want to make sure there's always enough room in it that it doesn't overflow before the next garbage truck comes. So that's an issue of, to me, I would want to take it out when I saw it as important. They would want it taken out when they saw it was important. And they would try to hint at me that it needs to be taken out, because culturally that typically works in American culture, that you can imply things and people sort of figure out what you mean. I wouldn't get it. Now, if someone had a talk with me and said, look, we feel it's important to take the garbage out early because it could overflow, the idea that it could end up full and we'd have to keep a full garbage bag around, that just hadn't even occurred to me. But knowing that would have probably, for me, made a difference because I would have seen, okay, this is a logical reason why to do it, that this behavior has come from a source. And that's sort of the idea here, is that we filter through our expectations, we filter through our understanding of the situation. So saying the garbage is a little full means something to us or to you that it may not mean to me or someone on the spectrum. Or it might mean something completely different. But if you were talking with someone who is very obviously from a different culture, who barely speaks English, then you would understand them getting confused by that a lot better because they barely speak English. So if you say the garbage is getting a little full, they don't have the idiom, they don't have the cultural understanding that we hint at things this way. They just have what is a language learned from a book or a teacher or a piece of software. And so we treat it differently. When they don't get what you meant, you become a lot less frustrated with them because you think, oh, they misunderstood me, rather than, oh, they're being lazy, oh, they're being a rebellious kid. And that's what I'm getting at here, is that, you know, is that I got frustrated because my parents were upset with me for not taking out the garbage, and I didn't know why. I genuinely felt like they hadn't told me it needs to be taken out. So I was upset, I was, you know, slamming doors or locking myself in my room or whatever. And they were upset because they saw me, in a large part, as a rebellious kid, someone who wasn't doing the chores that they wanted him to do. And really, it was an issue of miscommunication, an issue of cultural understanding, where I had no idea this is why they were angry with me. And so, you know, going into it with a question, you know, going into it with curiosity, if they had come out and you know, really sat down and tried to figure out why I wasn't taking out the garbage, and if we just taken a step back from that frustration and had, you know, you know, if they understood what they understood about me now in terms of how I take things, tend to take things literally, and if I understood what I do now, either one of those would have made the gap a lot smaller. But there is this gap, there's this cultural gap and this understanding gap where, you know, maybe not every person on the autism spectrum is liberal. Maybe some people on the autism spectrum need a lot of personal space, because a lot of them do, whereas other ones need very little personal space because they don't value it. The autism spectrum offers a lot of differences. There are people who are okay with loud noises, there are people who can't deal with loud noises, there are people who can't deal with strong smells, there are people who feel like they learn more about people from strong smells than other people do, there are people who hate physical contact, there are people who are very huggy. There's a lot of different expressions of autism. But one thing that is sort of constant among the whole thing is that we did develop differently. That we had challenges to observing facial expressions, things like that, the emotions of people understanding around us. And that's sort of how we pass on culture. We show people what we do. And you know, we do things around the house and our kids observe us doing it. And through that, they develop a similar culture to us. They see us mowing the lawn every week, and they get that lawn is something you mow every week. And then maybe they work back from that to why you do it. We need to keep it short because that looks nice. But someone on the autism spectrum may not work back from that. So you can tell them the lawn needs to be mowed every week, but they don't know why. They think you're just making them do it. Maybe, you know, they don't enjoy it. Maybe you're just trying to torture them. I don't know. And so without going that step further and saying, well, here's why we do it, that you know, maybe it's an agreement in our neighborhood where everyone has to have the lawn, you know, nice looking relative to everyone else's, or maybe it's something else. But without that communication of why we do things, of why it's important to us, of why it's a part of our culture, you don't get anywhere. And the first step is remembering that they picked up different things than we did. They are always another culture. It may look similar, but similar, again, is not the same as identical. And figuring out where those differences are is key to reducing frustration.
Did you experience a lot of those same frustrations with peers? Maybe like a miscommunication and understanding words, what they were saying, and they were misunderstanding what you were saying? And if so, looking back, what do you think might have been the best way to approach that? Would it have been a conversation with your friends about the way you see the world, or having parents discuss that with their parents?
I mean, one thing I'm going to say right now is I have poor episodic memory. I'm not really good at remembering how I felt back then clearly or things that happened. So it's a little hard for me to talk about this through the lens of what I actually experienced. But from what I know now, I think honestly, it would have helped a lot for parents to talk with parents to start with, because I would not have been able to communicate well what I was seeing versus what someone else was seeing. And you know, in high school and before that, honestly, we're not very mature. We aren't very well able to understand that clearly through our own things. In high school, you were still developing a personal culture. I mean, you were developing a personal culture all your life, but in high school especially, it's very strong. Especially with trying to date and things like that. There's a lot of strong emotions that someone on the autism spectrum might not pick up. So, while I think it would be hugely beneficial to talk with your peers about it, to try to understand where communication errors were, I think that it would be really most helpful anytime there is a problem, especially, that a third party can be involved in it, because typically someone on the autism spectrum is maybe trying to approach it logically, or maybe trying to approach it through a different emotional response than the other person. So you've got person A who's considered neurotypical and they're very angry. Person B is now upset and crying because they have no idea what went wrong. And they probably aren't going to be able to work it out very well, honestly, just because, you know, honestly, high school students aren't very able to handle their own normal emotional responses to things without, you know, throwing in someone who's interacting with it very differently. And there's not a lot of cultural sensitivity in high school. You have a lot of bullying just for any difference, whether it's a normal difference or a weird difference. You know, if they come from another country, you bully them about their accent. If they come from, you know, whatever. So it's very hard to work through. So I would say, yeah, I would want to have some sort of third party who's helping to bridge that gap again. Anyone else?
How has it changed yourself knowing that you are in the spectrum? Like, has it helped you just kind of make sense, like, oh, maybe that's why I was feeling that way, or has it made a difference by you now?
Well, I'll start with how I got diagnosed. When I was 22, I read an article about Asperger's, and reading it, by that point I'd been diagnosed with ADD, that didn't really help, the medicine didn't really help, I'd suffered with depression a few times, nothing really worked. I read an article about Asperger's, and reading that article, every point they had about it, I was like, that really sounds like me. So as soon as I finished that one article, I emailed it on to my parents and said, here is something I've read about. I don't want to diagnose myself, I don't want to read more about it and try to, convince myself that's it. I was afraid of being a bit of a hypochondriac about saying, this is what I've got, and then starting to act like it. So I sent it on to my mom and my dad and said, here's something I've read, it really sounds like the troubles I've been having, what do you think? And they researched it more, and then we found someone who specializes in it, and we went and talked with them and got a diagnosis. And as soon as I had a diagnosis, it was in a way like night and day, because before it was unknown. I had no idea what was going on other than I couldn't interact with people, things were going wrong. Usually I was upset, they were upset. I thought I hadn't done anything wrong, they thought they hadn't done anything wrong. We were seeing the world through different things, and I had no tools for understanding it. And that's what diagnosis is. Diagnosis is not the end of the world in any way. Instead, what it is a starting point, because with autism, with any disease really that you've had since birth, it's something that you're struggling with since birth. It's problems that you've always had. And a diagnosis is not the end of the world, but rather the point where you start being able to identify tools that can help. Because, if you don't know you have a broken leg, you're walking around, it hurts, but you don't know you have a broken leg, so you don't know you can just splint it or put it in a cast, you just know my leg hurts. And if you keep walking on a broken leg, it's going to heal up crooked, and then it's going to be harder to fix because they have to re-break it and then splint it straight. That's the same with autism. It's something, I don't want to say broken because that has a very negative connotation, but it's something you struggle with. And as you develop with it, you're not picking up the social cues of people around you, and you're sort of skewing further and further from the normal culture of people around you. And if you want to integrate, if you want to get along with them, you can't start doing it until you've noticed this difference, until you've identified this difference, and realized, okay, here's what's wrong. You can start learning about autism, you can start learning about the symptoms of autism, the treatments for autism, the options you have out there. You can start identifying, what am I doing that makes it difficult for me to get along? You can start talking to other people about it so they can say, well, how can we make it easier for you to integrate with us and interact with us? So without that diagnosis, I think I would be much worse off than I was today. One thing that it really helped with was just straight up the depression, because I was depressed because I didn't get it. And it didn't go away. I mean, as I said, I'm on medication for it, but it became much easier to handle because I could identify this is where a large part of the depression is coming from. This is what I'm struggling with. And anytime I ran into a problem, I said, okay, now I've identified a problem, I can work on it. Whereas before I would say, okay, something has gone wrong, and I have no idea what's going wrong. I have no one I can talk with about it. When I ask people questions, if you ask someone why you're angry, they'll get angry at you because you don't get why they're angry. And they think, well, okay, you're not identifying with me, you're not empathizing with me. So I'm angry, you're like, why are you angry with me? And they're like, you don't get why I'm angry with you? It's a feedback loop that just takes you further and further away from productive interaction. So having the diagnosis was probably the best moment in helping me get better. And I'm not there now, I have a long way to go, but I am much further along than I would have been without it, and much better off than I would have been without it. Anyone else? Any questions? Any thoughts? All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, you have sheets.
We hand them out.
You're handing them out?
They have them.
Oh, you have them? You've handed out, okay, you've all been given feedback sheets. I would really appreciate any feedback. I know I spoke quickly. It took longer when I practiced it, but I speak very quickly when I get anxious. We filmed this, we're going to put it up on YouTube, which will be posted on our Facebook page. So if I zoomed past anything and you want to hear it again, or comment on it, or let us know, we'd love to receive any feedback. Thank you very much, everybody.